Shards For His Gift. A Cursebreaker novel. By Melinda Cozier. Acknowledgements. Thank you to all our supporters on Patreon, especially Glenda Andre. Without your generous support, this book might not have happened. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey. If you would like to support the series you love and help me get the books out faster, then head over to Patreon to join us. Read my books before anyone else. Get thanked in the next book, along with whatever else Rand dreams up. Knock knock. This story takes place after Cursebreaker revealed and refers to events in that book. Rand opened the door, but the hallway was empty, aside from the statues frozen in fight sequences scattered about. They glared at him with glowing crystal eyes, but Rand ignored them because they did that every day. Pairs of halo-wearing statues flanked the door too, but they weren't fighting or staring at him. Those statues just looked at each other, but they didn't knock on the door. Statues couldn't do that. So who knocked? Rand glanced around again in case he missed something. Bluish light shone down on him from the Lumiere crystal mosaic on the ceiling, high overhead, as movement caught his eye. Either a shadow flitted around the bend, or he just glimpsed the mysterious knocker. Even if the knocker ran, could they reach the bend in the hallway without him seeing them? The shadow was small, so it might just be a cat running away when it heard him open the door. A cat could have run behind the statues and he wouldn't have seen it. Where did the knocker go? Rand glanced at the woman statue cradling a male statue that would have slid off her lap if he wasn't made of stone. Neither statue answered him. Rand listened, but he just heard a faint echo of footsteps in the main transept. I could go to the bend and look. But that meant leaving Inari and Nolo's flat, and he wasn't supposed to do that without Papa or Uncle Murren. I won't do it. Papa got hurt really bad the last time I went out without permission. It was my fault Papa got hurt. Rand gripped the door. It was an inch thick and made of the same stuff as Nulthur's door, but it wasn't wood. Uncle Murren said all the wood in Shiari was enchanted, and that was why the door wasn't made of wood. No one ever said what the door was made of, but it was hard like wood and striated too. Maybe the door was made of stone. What are you doing? Nerul asked from behind him. He was Inari and Nolo's son, and he was a bunch of years older than Rand and a bunch of years younger than Uncle Murren. But he seemed like a nice boy. I heard someone knock at the door, so I went to see who it was. But there was no one out here when I opened the door. Rand swung the door wide open to show him. See. Nerul looked more like his dark-skinned father than his mother, but he was more talkative than his dad. Nolo brooded a lot, but he had an important job, according to Uncle Murren. Inari was always sunny, and some of that sunniness had rubbed off on her son because he was smiling. Why was he smiling? I see. What's that on the doormat? Nerul pointed. Rand spun and stared. There was a shiny blue box on the mat. That wasn't there when I opened the door. A ribbon wrapped around the box, and someone tied it into a big bow that tickled his fingers when he reached to pick up the gift. I never saw a box like that before. The box shimmered in the Lumiere crystal light like it was a crystal, but it would be cold and hard if it was, and the box wasn't like that. It must be for someone in your family. That was only logical since Nerul's parents owned the apartment. Who was it for? It's probably not for me. Only a few people know I live here. None had visited, but Rand hoped Furball would, since Nulthur's flat was just on the other side of this floor. But Furball might be grounded after their little adventure went awry a few days ago. We were just looking for Savine, so we could meet his mom and find out what happened to the baby dragon. Rand hung his head. He still couldn't believe an adult dragon lived somewhere under the mountain. But his friend was a baby dragon, so his mom couldn't be anything else because that wouldn't make sense. Besides, Shiari was a magical country. If it could have mages, then why not dragons too? I still want to meet her. But Rand shuddered at the thought of descending to the lower quarters again. That's where everything had gone wrong 3 days ago. Who's the gift for? Nerul rounded the couch, but he left his door ajar. The mysterious gift was more interesting than finding out what was in his room, so Rand stayed in the doorway, unsure about what to do now. I don't know. I don't know how to read yet. Rand pointed to the card tucked under the bow. Can you read it? Rand hoped so because otherwise he'd have to disturb Uncle Murren, and he didn't want to do that. His brave uncle needed to rest and stop worrying about Papa. I'll worry about him since he got hurt to save me. Rand glanced at the door across from Uncle Murren's and worry weighed him down. The door was also ajar because he didn't close it when he raced to the front door. Through that gap light fell, but it wasn't green because Papa must sleep or his wounds wouldn't heal. So that light came from the window or a Lumiere crystal since Papa hated darkness. Yes, I go to school like your uncle. Let me see it. Nerul took the gift from his nerveless hands before it could fall and studied the card. It's for you. Ran opened his mouth but no words came out. For a moment he knew how Papa felt when words failed him. Who sent me a gift? Does it say on the card? Because the only people who gave him things were in this flat. So they couldn't have left it on the doorstep. Besides, it wouldn't make sense for them to leave a gift out there when they could just hand it to him. I only have 2 friends, Furball and Savine. But they wouldn't leave a gift and run. They would have waited until I opened the door and at least said hello, and maybe came in for a cup of milk and a cookie. Inari always had cookies. Ran glanced at the kitchen, which lay beyond the couches in the living room, and the dining table and its chairs. I don't deserve a cookie. Not when Papa couldn't eat anything but gruel until the wounds in his stomach healed. Will you open it and see what's inside? Nirul held the box out. He was much taller than Ran, but that made sense since Nirul was like double his age or something. Yes? But it's a pretty package, so I must be careful. Ran hurried to the couch and left the apartment door open. Nirul closed it, then followed him. Do you want help with that? Sure. Ran plopped onto the couch. It was nice living in a place with furniture to sit on, and it had windows too that overlooked the meadow spreading from the rocky feet of Mount Eredrin. Their previous 2 homes, a damp cave in the lower quarters and Nulthur's cramped apartment, didn't have much furniture. Nulthur's flat had windows, but not as many as Inari's and Nolo's flat. Light shined in through the kitchen window and spotlit a napkin-covered plate. A pitcher of tea stood next to it, but Ran wasn't hungry, not when he had a mystery on his hands. Another couch faced this one, but no one sat there now. A blanket covered the place where Papa bled through the red, stained gauze wrapped around his waist. Was that only 3 days ago? It felt like more time passed. A bad person stabbed him twice, Uncle Murren said the other day. But Ran wasn't supposed to know that since he'd listened in when his uncle explained what happened to Nolo and Inari. Then Papa was unconscious and couldn't explain anything, so that task fell to his brother. Papa's in big trouble because of me. Ran stared at the box on his lap, as other things he'd overheard since coming here rattled around in his mind and heart. I wish I'd known about the boy sooner. I'd have found him a good home, Nolo said just last night, but Inari stayed silent. Ran blinked when tears blurred the present sitting on his lap. It was taller and wider than his 2 hands side by side. I don't deserve this gift. Ran set it on the low table between the couches. Nirul sat opposite him and leaned forward. Why not? You've only been here a few days, but you were very good during that time. Not good enough. Ran hugged himself as tears slid down his cheeks. Worry wrapped hot hands around him and squeezed. What if Papa didn't get better? If I was better, then Papa wouldn't be hurt right now. That's not true. Those people were bad. They would have come after your father at another time. Uncle Murren opened the door on the other side of the living room. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time and they took advantage of that, but it wasn't your fault. Do you really think so? Ran rubbed his eyes as Uncle Murren sat next to him. Yes, I do. You're the best little boy in the world. Uncle Murren put an arm around his shoulders and gathered him in for a hug. Ran leaned into his brave uncle. What about Papa? Will he? Ran broke off, unable to say the word, but he must know, even if the answer scared him. No, your father's a fighter. He'll get better. It just might take a while since we don't know how much healing that ghost could do through the ranger's medic. But it didn't sound like Uncle Murren believed what he was saying. Nor did he smile. He wore the same serious expression as always, just minus the furrow in his brow because he wasn't doing schoolwork right now. But he regarded Ran steadily with his warm brown eyes, and that dared him to hope his uncle was right. It was kind of far-fetched though. Ghosts didn't usually possess people and use their bodies to heal other people. But the ghost man wouldn't have done that if Auntie Sovan didn't make a deal with him. I hope Auntie Sovan's okay. After all, she took the ghost with her when she left. She's fine. Uncle Murren squeezed him tight. How do you know that? Ran leaned into him. She can walk through walls. Trust me. She's fine. Uncle Murren rested his chin on his head, and he was probably right. Auntie Sovan was a tough lady, but she always seemed a bit lost. Don't take this the wrong way, but is your aunt an angel? I'm only asking because she had wings and a halo, and only angels have that. Nirul held both hands up in surrender. Oh right, he saw her because the healing and making a deal thing happened in this apartment, while Papa lay right where Nirul sat. Ran blinked to clear his sight. Yes, she is. It's a long story how she got that way, but I remember enough to tell you if you want, just not now. Ran wiped his eyes on his sleeve and felt a bit lighter since he let the sadness out. Papa always said it was a good idea to do that. Bottling things up just made you feel worse, or so he said, and he was always right. Ran glanced at the door to the room where Papa rested. What's this? Uncle Murren picked the gift up off the table and studied it. It's a present, and Nirul says it's for me. But it doesn't say who it's from. Ran no longer felt like opening it. He stared at the door he left partially ajar. Was Papa really healing like Uncle Murren said? It shouldn't bind me. Sarn couldn't see anything except darkness. Go away. I need to see. But there was no light of any color, just darkness without end or shape. But there should be light. Why aren't my eyes glowing? Papa? Don't worry. I'm coming, Ran said, and his voice echoed. Where are you, son? Sarn scanned the darkness, but there was no sign of his son. Nor did he hear the boy's footsteps, and Ran wasn't a quiet child. But the boy didn't reply either. Doesn't he hear me? Sarn reached for his magic to banish this darkness, but it didn't come. Where's my magic? He would have stared at his hands in horror if he could see them. Wasn't his magic inside him? Yes, it was. He felt its presence like a covered flame within him. Why wasn't it responding? A flash of memory provided a clue and a question. Are you mad at me again? Sarn recalled talking to his magic a while ago. That was a recent event, wasn't it? Yes, it was. Why did I talk to my magic? When the answer came, he felt weak and would have collapsed if he was standing. But he didn't think he was because he couldn't feel the ground under his feet, and he always felt its presence, even when wearing boots and thick socks. Am I lying down? Why would I be? As Sarn cast about for a reason, a dull ache in his belly and back throbbed, and he felt again the sharp bite of the blade stabbing him. Missing once was an accident. I should have stopped the second stab. But he didn't. I was tired, and my magic was too. Where are you, magic? Why won't you answer me? A green light kindled in the dark, and the light divided into a roughly man-shaped cloud, shining in the dark. But it didn't shed any light on his surroundings. Why didn't you come when I called? Sarn couldn't tell if his magic stood across from him or floated above him. Everything was so topsy-turvy. Or maybe it's just me. My head's spinning. Why couldn't we fight him? His magic leaned forward as two brighter spots appeared in its face, and they stared at him like a pair of pupilless eyes. You're talking about Hadroville. Sarn closed his eyes. He didn't want to see that man's face or remember his return. He's gone now. We never need to deal with him again. That was all thanks to his sister, Sovan. I owe her for that. Yes, him. Why couldn't we resist him? He controlled us, and we didn't like it. We want to know why. His magic sat beside him, illuminating a bed but nothing more. Fear choked Sarn and he couldn't breathe for a moment. I can't black out. I must get a grip on the fear and get out of here. When the constriction eased, he reached for his head map, but nothing happened. His magic just sat there, waiting for an answer. Am I in the infirmary? Answer me. That place isn't safe for us. Sarn tried to sit up, but a glowing green arm shot out and stopped him. No, you're not in that place. Then where are we? Sarn glanced around, but his magic still didn't light anything more than the bed and him lying there. Somewhere safe. His magic waved away that concern. Why couldn't we resist him? We belong to you, not him. He shouldn't have any power over us. Why did he have that? His magic leaned forward until they were almost nose to nose. You couldn't disobey him because I couldn't. Sarn dropped his magic's fiery green eyes. Why couldn't we? Answer us. His magic banged his fist on the bed, but the mountain didn't shake. Sarn covered his magic's glowing fist, blotting out some of its light. Because I made a promise. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. I wanted my brother to go to school, and that was the price. No. You promised another man, not that monster. We hate him. His magic shook his glowing green head. Either Sarn was imagining it, or the glowing man sitting at his bedside was starting to look and sound like him. I must be imagining that. He rubbed his eyes. Yes, that's true, but I also promised to obey anyone that man told me to obey. Yes, we know this. We've been with you for many years, and we were there when you promised that. But it shouldn't bind us. Why did it? His magic shot across the room and reformed by a window. Where under Mount Eredrin was there a window? It must be one of the above-ground levels. If only he could rise and go to that window. The view should tell him where he was, since his magic wouldn't. It wasn't normally this stingy with information. Why was it acting like this? Why did that promise force us to obey him? His magic slammed a green fist into the windowsill and it flexed. But didn't crumble because it was stone, and this magic loved stonework too much to harm it just to make a point. I don't know. Sarn rolled onto his side and stopped when that movement pulled on his healing wounds. But you have a guess? I know you do. His magic gazed out the window, but it still wouldn't let any of its light extend beyond that window. I have another type of magic. Sarn glanced away. He didn't want that other magic, but he was stuck with it. You only need me. You don't need it. That's true, but I still have it. For all the good it had done him. Sarn closed his eyes and tried to ignore the throbbing in his back and belly. He hoped the pain was a sign the wounds were healing, but he couldn't confirm that because neither magic he had access to could heal anything. So far, that white magic was more trouble than it was worth. His earth magic was far more useful, even though it had a mind of its own. I wish it couldn't bind you. But I don't think I can stop it. And that was the worst part of all this. That white magic had more power over him than he had over it, and no wishing that were otherwise would change it. Sarn sighed because there wasn't anything else he could do right now. It works on promises, yes. His earth magic shot across the room and reappeared at his bedside. From what I understand, yes, but I don't know if it's limited to that. Sarn felt impelled to point out. So much of that white magic was a mystery because it only came when it wanted to, rarely ever when he called it, unlike his earth magic. Promise it will never bind me. Promise me, and that should fix it. No. A white light gathered at the other end of the room. Oh great, now his other magic wanted to chat. Sarn groaned. Yes, I won't do your bidding. His earth magic shot across the room and appeared near the cloud of white magic, but it retained its human shape. His white magic stayed a shimmering cloud. You must. You're part of something bigger. While I just am. The white cloud expanded like it was spreading its arms to encompass something larger than itself. His earth magic raked the white cloud with a glare. Well, you can't have him. He belongs to me. We are an earth mage, not whatever you are. The glowing green man gestured to Sarn. This must be why none of the old tales talk about mages having access to more than one power. All they do is fight. Sarn would have shaken his head if he wasn't lying down with a soft pillow under his head. Darkness eclipsed the room as the green light winked out. But we don't fight, his earth magic said in his mind as it settled over him like a warm blanket. You and I are one, and we protect everyone. Yes, we do. Sarn opened his eyes, and that familiar green glow wreathed his sight as it illuminated a bedside table laden with a pitcher, a glass, and covered dishes. There was a closet, a writing table, and a padded chair like the ones in the library in a corner by a small table with a book on it. But something else caught his gaze. Above a dresser, a mirror hung on the wall, and it reflected the glow of his eyes back at him. Where am I? Who had enough money to buy a real mirror? He felt the silver covering the glass from across the room. It called to him. What do I look like now? It had been years since he dared to look upon his face. What must I look like after so many trials and tribulations? Were his scars still visible? Part of Sarn didn't want to know, but the rest was curious. He'd seen Rand's face countless times and wondered about his own. Everyone said they looked startlingly alike. And I don't look like my mother. Neither did Sovan though. But she was his twin sister, so she should look like him. Sarn almost laughed at himself for framing it that way when she was the elder of the two of them, and she liked to remind him about that at every opportunity. But he sobered as the mirror beckoned to him. If I look in that mirror, will I see myself or the face of the father I never knew? Running footsteps startled him out of his thoughts. Sarn put the question aside. His body felt heavy, though some of the dizziness faded when his magic stopped interrogating him. Perhaps he'd just lie here since he didn't have the energy to rise. He could look in the mirror later if he dared, or not at all. I don't have to look. I've had this face for 20 years and only a vague idea of what I look like. Sarn rolled slowly and painfully onto his other side to face the door as it swung wide open, and a small shadow rushed in. The gift. You should open it. Uncle Murren nudged him with his elbow. No, only good boys get presents, and I'm not a good boy. You almost got hurt when those bad people came looking for me. Rand sniffled as tears rolled down his face again. He could still feel the bad man's arm around his legs and his hard shoulder digging into his belly when the bad man carried him off, even though he was free now. Uncle Murren had found him in the dark room they'd left him in, of course, because that's what uncles did. Isaiah also popped in for a visit. But my angel only did that because I said I'll tell Auntie Sovan that he left me alone in the dark. Rand almost laughed when he remembered his guardian angel's reaction to that threat. I would have told her too because she needed to know such things. You are a good boy. One mistake doesn't make you bad. It just makes you human, like the rest of us. We all make mistakes. Uncle Murren tried to hand him the gift again. You really think so? Rand knuckled his eyes as he remembered a sharp knife stabbing at his uncle. But I didn't get hurt, and we're okay now. Uncle Murren set the gift on the couch next to him and hugged Rand until the tears dried on his cheeks. You're okay, not because of me. If Auntie Sovan didn't come when she did, then you'd be hurt, and Ran trailed off because he couldn't say the word dying. Hey, I fended that guy off for a while with my trusty crutch, and I'd have kept doing that even if she hadn't come. But I appreciate her help. Uncle Murren squeezed him tight again. Ran laughed despite everything, and the sadness eased its grip on him so it wasn't crushing him anymore. That was funny when she said, "You have something that belongs to me." Ran loved his aunt, but he still wished Papa came to help them instead. Papa didn't find them until later because he got hurt really bad. "I hope you'll be okay, Papa," like Uncle Murren says. But it was hard to believe it after what that medic said. Ran wiped his eyes on his sleeve. "Your dad will be okay. He won't let a couple of stab wounds stop him for long. You'll see." Uncle Murren let go so he could tweak his nose. "Do you feel better now?" Ran nodded, because he did feel a little better, but there was still a big ball of sadness inside him, and it wouldn't go away until Papa got better. "Good. Now open your gift. I want to see what's inside." Uncle Murren placed the package on his lap. "You open it. Your birthday is coming." Ran pronounced birthday with an F in the middle of the word to get a rise out of his uncle, but he got a one-armed hug instead. He needed that more than a correction, though. "My birthday isn't for a few weeks yet, and this gift is addressed to you. You should open it." Uncle Murren tapped the gift sitting on Ran's lap, and it shimmered in the gold light of the Lumiere crystals on the lacy gold thing overhead. Round thingies set in the stone ceiling reflected the light in pretty patterns, ensuring it reached every corner of the space. "I hope we can stay here." Ran turned the gift and searched for how to open it. "I just pull this to untie it, right?" Ran tapped the pretty blue ribbon before thoughts about home could depress him again. "Yes? The bow should fall apart if you do." Uncle Murren gripped his knees. Ran pulled, and the bow untied itself like magic. But the ribbon didn't glow, so it probably didn't have any magic at all. Oh well. It was soft, so he draped it around his neck like a skinny scarf. "What's the box made of?" Ran touched it. The box was cold and smooth like a polished crystal, but it wasn't transparent like a crystal should be. Asking what it was made of delayed the opening part, and Ran needed to do that to keep the sadness at bay. "That is a pretty box." Nerul leaned forward to examine it. He still sat on the couch across from them, but he was so quiet, Ran forgot he was there during the whole crying thing. But Nerul didn't even mention it. Maybe he knew how important it was to let the sadness out. "Yes, it is. I think it's made from some kind of rock." Uncle Murren tapped on the box, and it made the same dull sound as a fingernail striking a rock. "It could be made from some kind of shell. That would also make it shine in the light." Nerul shrugged, but he smiled because this had become a puzzle, and his smile was contagious. Ran found himself smiling too, and the sadness and worry faded some. "I never saw a shell like this. It's too big." "No, it's not. I've seen plenty of larger ones along the river Nerthal. Next summer, I'll show them to you." Nerul said that like he believed, they would still be here next summer. But that was many months from now, and there was some trouble between his father and Papa. "I'd like that. I want to see these shells." Ran hoped he would still live here in this place of thick carpets he could dig his toes into. Since Inari baked that morning, the room smelled like spice cookies. "Then we'll make a day of it." Nerul nodded like he already had this excursion all planned out, even though he hadn't asked Papa for permission. Ran smiled at his enthusiasm. Papa would say yes, and he'd probably come along if he was well by then. Ran turned the box this way and that, but he didn't want to open it anymore. Thoughts of Papa lying in the next room doing something called recuperating sucked all the cheer out of the bright room until a green light kindled within. "You need to slide the lid along the grooves to open it. Here, let me help you." Uncle Murren must have taken the box because its weight left his lap. "Papa's awake." Ran sprang to his feet and rushed toward that beautiful green light shining out of Papa's eyes. "Ran, wait. He needs to rest," Uncle Murren said, but Ran pulled open the door and rushed inside before he could stop him. "Are we okay? Ran?" Sarn extended his hand toward the silhouetted child in the doorway. His heart already confirmed the boy was his son, but he was glad when his eyes brightened enough to illuminate Ran's face. Why didn't his son come to him? There was only one reason his son might hesitate, and a cold fear gripped Sarn. "Ran, are you okay?" His magic must have shared his fear because it shot out of his hand in a green cloud and wrapped a shield around Ran, then nudged the boy closer. "Yes, I'm okay. The bad men didn't hurt me, but they hurt Will. They just scared me, but then Uncle Murren came, and I wasn't alone anymore." Ran looked at his toes, not at him, and that was weird. Ran was an earnest kid who liked to look people in the eyes when he talked to them. Sarn lifted the boy's chin so he met his searching gaze. "Are you really okay?" Ran turned his head as tears ran down his face and shook his head. Sarn cupped the boy's face with his hand and wiped the tears away with his thumb. What's wrong? You got hurt because of me, and now you'll go away like Mama did. No, I got hurt because I couldn't use my magic to block the first wound and, Sarn sighed, but he'd better admit it. I didn't block the second one because I didn't see it coming, but I should have. I knew Metron was a snake, and snakes always turn and bite people. But none of this was making his son feel any better, as the tears still running down his little face proved. Sarn tried to swing his legs over the side of the bed and sit up, but that made his head spin until he flopped onto his back. I need to hold him. Surely that would make his son feel better and reassure him. But Sarn couldn't pick him up while he lay on his back. But we can pick him up for you, his magic whispered as it lifted Ran and set him on the bed. Papa? Ran only got that one word out before Sarn pulled him into his arms. I love you, Sarn said into his son's soft hair. And just like that, everything snapped into place. His map appeared in his peripheral vision and starred the flat they occupied. It belonged to Nolo and Inari, but neither of their icons were in this flat right now. Sarn? How are you feeling? Murren asked from the doorway. I'm thirsty and so glad to see you. Come over here. I have so many questions. But there were a couple Sarn could answer on his own, since he knew where he was now and why his magic had withheld that information. You didn't want me to freak out. Yes, they've been caring for you for 3 days by our count, said his earth magic, and it was good to have that confirmed. Sarn held his son to his racing heart and tried not to think about what would happen next. He was in no condition to do anything. But I will fight for my son. I'll do anything to keep him. Would you give us away? Asked his earth magic. Yes, I'll pay any price for him, but I don't think it'll come to that. At least Sarn hoped it wouldn't because he didn't want to part with his earth magic. They could have the white one though. It was more of a nuisance than a helper. But he could do nothing about any of that now, except hold his son close and dry his eyes on his tunic. It wasn't your fault. Sometimes bad things happen, and this would have happened even if you'd stayed put. I love you too, Papa. Ran lay on his chest like a sad rag doll, but that sadness would pass away like clouds after a rainstorm. I'll reassure him until it does. Sarn took one hand off his son and extended his hand to his brother, waiting in the doorway. Murren had been brave too, and Ran had come away from his misadventure without a scratch because of his dear brother. At least I don't need to worry about losing Murren. Too many promises bound them now. No one could separate them never again, and that brought Sarn some peace. Murren smiled as he clasped his hand. If you're thirsty, then you should drink something. Murren glanced at the table beside the bed and would have reached for the pitcher and a glass if Sarn let go, but he didn't. I know and I will. But tell me what happened after I blacked out. I remember the tunnel. I found you and Ran, and we talked for a few minutes, but then it's all blackness. How did I get here? Sarn had other questions too, like how wounded was he? But he couldn't ask them here in front of his sensitive son. Well, Sovan came back and Nolo showed up, then his wife and another ranger, Ranaspara. Murren scratched his head with his free hand. Was he editing this account? Auntie Sovan carried me because there were a lot of steps and I hate them, Ran said. Sarn squeezed his brave little boy. As long as we live under this mountain, you'll have to climb steps sometimes. Ran groaned and Sarn laughed at his reaction. It felt so good to laugh. In the weeks leading up to this, he didn't laugh often. Ain't that the truth? Murren laughed too, then sobered. I can guess what happened next. Nolo carried me out of that tunnel, didn't he? Yeah, but he had help, and you should drink something. I can hear how thirsty you are. Murren lifted the pitcher and poured out a glass. Thanks. Sarn let go of his brother's hand and tried to lever himself up enough to drink while still holding tight to his son with one arm. He just wasn't ready to let the boy go, not yet, and maybe not ever. Ran was the light of his life. Here. Let me help you. Murren handed him the glass, then slid an arm under his shoulders and lifted until Sarn could drain the glass. Then Auntie Sovan made a deal with a ghost and a demon thing and went into a medic person. Then he healed a part of you called internal organs, but I didn't understand that part, Ran said, and the out of context comment confused him. Sarn almost spat out the sweetened tea in his mouth, but he swallowed instead because his body demanded it. The tea slid down his throat and moistened it. She did what? Sarn asked after he drained the glass, and Murren removed his arm. His brother took the empty glass and filled it, but Sarn waved it away in favor of interrogating his family. Ran repeated his previous comment, and it was no less stunning now than it was the first time. I heard you, but I still don't understand. Sarn patted his son's back. Neither do we. Murren set the full glass on the table and sat on the edge of the bed. How do you feel? Sarn stifled a yawn. His eyes felt heavy like they wanted to close. This bed was the most comfortable surface he'd ever lay on, and that must be making him sleepy. Plus, Ran was a warm weight on his heart. Sarn, maybe you should get some more rest. Murren rose and squeezed his shoulder. I will in a bit. I'm just tired and sore, but I feel okay otherwise. Sarn was also dizzy and weak, but a meal would fix that now that he was conscious again. I'll eat something later. I just need to rest my eyes and hug my son. Sarn yawned again and didn't hide it. Sleep slid closer on silent feet, and he didn't fight when it took hold until someone pried his hand off his son's back. No, I want to stay with Papa. Ran struggled, but someone slid their hands under his belly and lifted him out of his grip. Sarn extended his hand to grab his son, but his arm fell back to his side. He tried to open his eyes, but they were too heavy, so he left them closed and reached for his magic instead. Fetch my son. No. I want to stay. No, you need to come with me and let him rest. We'll visit again later, Murren said. And the magic sank back into Sarn. Before sleep claimed him, Sarn sent it one command. Protect my son. The world blackened, but he heard a faint reply. We will. No one will harm him. A strange light. All his fears slid away when Papa's magic lifted him and set him on the bed. Ran could still feel Papa's muscular arms around him and hear the steady beating of his heart. That finally drained all the worry from him and the sadness too. Papa wouldn't hug him like that if he was dying. Ran carried that certainty with him when Uncle Murren ripped him from Papa's arms and hugged him tight. Ran leaned his head on his uncle's shoulder as Uncle Murren closed the door behind him, leaving Papa in the dark since his eyes glowed. No, you need to leave it open a little to let the light in. Ran extended his hand, but his arm wasn't long enough to reach the door. Uncle Murren sighed. I know, but he needs to rest, and he won't if he hears us talking in the living room. I can be quiet, Ran whispered into his uncle's shoulder to prove it. But can you stay quiet? Uncle Murren tapped Ran's nose, then laughed when Ran scowled at him. Of course I can. I'm a big boy, and big boys are quiet like Papa. Some are, but you and I aren't quiet. Uncle Murren turned and regarded the door. At least he was thinking about opening it. Maybe he needed the door open too. Please open the door a little so we can see Papa? I won't wake him. Ran drew a cross over his tunic with his finger. Besides, Papa had lost some hearing in one ear, so even though he was a light sleeper, that hearing loss should keep him from hearing everything. Okay. Uncle Murren opened the door, revealing the orange glow of a Lumiere crystal on the bedside table. Ran didn't remember seeing that crystal before, but it was dim compared to how brightly Papa's eyes blazed. That must be why he didn't notice it until now. Uncle Murren left the door ajar, even though Papa had some light without it. Why does Papa sleep so much? Ran asked as his uncle headed for the couch again. I think that tea had something in it to make him sleep. Uncle Murren set him on the couch. Why? That didn't make sense to Ran. If Papa needed to sleep, then he would fall asleep on his own without help. Because he needs to rest. Uncle Murren sat next to him. They're afraid too, Nerul said as he set the box he was examining on the table between the couches. What are they afraid of? Ran leaned back against an overstuffed pillow. Why would anyone fear Papa? He was the nicest person Ran knew. They fear his magic, right? Uncle Murren picked up the box from the table and examined it. I told them he won't hurt anyone. Sarn's not like that. Nerul adjusted the overstuffed pillow behind him. And why fear him now? He used to babysit me when I was your age. Nerul gestured to Ran. Ran opened his mouth a few times, but none of the questions popping into his head fell out. This was news to him and maybe to Uncle Murren too because his eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. The same shock must have caught his tongue too. Thankfully, Nerul realized they needed more information. Nerul laughed at his flabbergasted expression. This was years ago, but he used to watch me all the time while he was recovering from something. I never found out what happened, but your dad was on crutches then. So he couldn't run after me, but his magic could, and he let it out to play. Nerul smiled as his gaze drifted toward the room where Papa lay. I had so much fun. He was the best babysitter in the world. You're lucky to have him for a father. Well, if that smile was any indication, then Nerul was glad they were here. His smile was contagious though, and Ran felt his lips turn up as he caught that smile, and his uncle smiled too. Yeah, he's the best brother in the world too, even if he's a tad overprotective sometimes. And look what I figured out while we were talking. Uncle Murren grinned when part of the mysterious box slid back to reveal a hole. Well, that explained why there was no hinge. You opened it. Ran peered into the box when Uncle Murren lowered it. A star-shaped crystal lay inside the box, and it glowed softly like a proper crystal should. Papa had once said not all crystals glow. But he must have been joking because all the crystals Ran had ever seen had glowed, so he put that correction out of his mind. Besides, Papa laughed after he said it, so we must have been joking. Someone had drilled a hole in the topmost ray and pushed a white cord through it, then tied that cord into a loop. Rand slipped his fingers into the loop and lifted the crystal out of the box. Nerul rounded the table to examine the crystal at close range too, and Rand shifted over to make room for him so they could both stare at the pretty thing. The cord was too short to slide over his head. Why did it have a cord if it wasn't meant to be worn? Although it was heavier than a necklace should be, it was too long since it was a little longer and wider than his hand. Rand could shove his whole hand through the loop, so he did, and the crystal dangled from his wrist. But the crystal was way too big for a bracelet. What is it? It looks like an ornament. You should put it on the tree when we get one for the holidays. Nerul gestured to a sunny spot by the window, where the living room transitioned into the dining room. Maybe that's where this mysterious tree went. Why do you need a tree? Rand had to ask. Trees were enchanted and they had rules. How would his family get a tree when all the trees in Shiari were enchanted? It boggled his mind just thinking about it. The trees didn't like people to cut them down. Rand didn't know what would happen if someone tried, but it would be something bad because that was against the forest's rules. I hope I'll be here to find out more about this tree business. Nerul laughed at his expression. You'll see when it gets closer. Well, I need to finish something for school tomorrow. He rose and headed back to his room. Okay. Rand gazed into the crystal. Were there little lights inside it? Maybe you should let your dad look at it since it's a crystal. Uncle Murren scowled at the ornament like it had insulted him. Why? Rand turned the crystal over. It wasn't even sharp because someone had polished each vertex and rounded it. The little lights flew around inside the crystal's heart again. How could they do that? The ornament was only a little bigger than his hand. Uncle Murren sighed. Do I really need to explain why? Yes? Rand turned away and put his back to his uncle, so he could stare into the crystal without interference. It's a crystal, and crystals are often magical, especially around here. Your father should look at it and make sure that nothing in the crystal will harm you. Then you can have it. It won't hurt me. It's pretty. And pretty things had never harmed him before, so why would this be any different? It wouldn't be. Rand was certain of that. Uncle Murren was just jealous no one gave him such a pretty crystal. He's the mage. He needs to make that determination, not you. Uncle Murren snatched the crystal from his hands. Hey. I was looking at that. Give it back. Rand reached for the crystal, but Uncle Murren stood up and held it out of reach. Not until your father looks at it and declares it's safe for you to play with. Until then, I'll hold on to it. Uncle Murren grabbed the box it arrived in, placed the ornament back inside, and slid the lid closed. The room seemed darker without it. That's not fair. Rand hugged himself as his fears surrounded him again. The ornament was a nice distraction, but it was gone now, leaving him with nothing but worry again. No, but I need to keep you safe. Your father would never forgive me if anything happened to you. Uncle Murren ruffled his hair. Oh? Rand fiddled with an overstuffed pillow. That changed things. Uncle Murren wasn't being unfair. He was just looking out for me. Unfortunately, recent events proved he needed looking after. I don't want anything to happen to me either. Rand hung his head and hunched his shoulders. He had nothing to do now. Nerul went to do homework, and Papa was still healing, so there wouldn't be any adventures for a while. Come on. I'll read you a story. I picked up one before everything happened, and I never got a chance to read it to you. Uncle Murren was just being nice by not calling it what it was. You mean before I snuck out and got into trouble? Rand felt small and troublesome. People shouldn't have to go out of their way just to keep him safe. Come on. I'll read you that story. Uncle Murren patted his shoulder. A story would be nice, so Rand hopped off the couch and trudged after him. But Uncle Murren kept the box out of reach the whole way to his borrowed room, which wasn't far because it was just on the other side of the living room. Uncle Murren placed the box on a shelf near the bed, but Rand couldn't reach it, even after he scrambled on top of the bed. Drat. I'll have to wait until later. Rand flopped onto the puffy pillows. Besides, Uncle Murren must sleep sometime. When he does, I'll get the box and find out what those little lights are. For now, he'd enjoy the story, even though he didn't deserve to hear one. But he loved stories too much to turn down his uncle's offer. Another unexpected visitor. A knock on the front door stopped Uncle Murren just when he found the book in his rucksack. I wonder who that could be. Instead of pulling out the book, he pushed it back into his bag. Why did he do that? Rand couldn't read yet, but he could recognize some letters thanks to his uncle and the million questions he'd asked over the last 2 years about the stuff his uncle wrote in a book that looked a lot like the one Uncle Murren had just pushed back into his bag. It also had a light brown cover. I'll learn to read so one day I can read what my uncle's always writing. But Ran wouldn't learn that today. Should I answer it? Uncle Murren looked to him for an answer. It's not our place, but neither Inari nor Nolo are home right now. The knocker bore down on the door and rapped out a pattern that sent Uncle Murren running for the front door without a word of explanation. Drat. The story didn't even start yet, and someone was already interrupting it. But it must be someone important, given his uncle's reaction. Who could that be? Inari and Nolo wouldn't knock since this was their home and no one else had any business here. What if it was the same person who brought the gift, coming to see if he opened it? Ran glanced at the shelf where the box sat. He should leave it where his uncle put it, but if the person knocking was the gifter, they might want to see him playing with the crystal. Before Ran could stand up on the bed and try to reach the box, Will spoke. Why did Papa's friend come? Is he okay? Will asked and the question froze Ran. Was Will okay? He tried to save me. Ran couldn't stop seeing the bad man's friend swing his fist at Will. But Will was like Papa, not a fighter. Was Will okay? I need to know, and Papa will want to know too when he wakes up again. Ran hopped off the bed and raced to the front door to find out, and almost crashed into his uncle in his haste. A wide-eyed Will clung to the door jamb like it was the only thing holding him up, and his blue tunic was askew. But that was unlike Will. Papa's friend always looked ready to head down to the harbor to work. Bruises still marred his face, but they looked like they were healing since they were yellow and green, not purple anymore. Are you okay? Did those men hurt you real bad? Ran tugged on Will's blue pants to get his attention. It was hard to tell if adults were okay, and sometimes they didn't know either. Will snapped out of his shock, and his hand hovered an inch above Ran's head like he wasn't sure if he should pat him on the head. Yeah, I'm okay. Are you okay? I was so afraid for you when Metron carried you away from me. Will raked him with anxious eyes. He must be looking for bruises. But Ran didn't have any. I'm okay. They didn't hurt me. The bad man just dumped him in a dark room and locked the door. That was it, and Ran was glad that was all. He didn't want to think about what the men had wanted to do, but he could still hear it, and it still didn't make sense. How could anyone sell a child? Ran pushed that question out of his mind. Papa would want to know how his friend was, but Ran didn't know what else to ask. Is he okay? Will must have asked Uncle Murren, because the question didn't sound like it was directed at him. Yeah, he's fine. No one touched him. He wasn't alone for long. I found him pretty quickly, so we got lucky there, and they had other plans than what you're thinking. Uncle Murren rested a hand on Ran's shoulder and pulled him back to his side. But that's not what brought you here. Will seemed to cave in on himself. I wish it was. I wanted to check on you guys, but there's been a lot of stuff going on at the harbor, and I needed to help out. Will shrugged like that wasn't the most interesting thing he said since he arrived. What's happening at the harbor? Ran had seen it from the balconies overlooking the river, on the rare occasions that Papa took him over there. But he hadn't seen them up close. Too many people gathered on the wharves, and Papa didn't like crowds. It's just the usual. Everyone's trying to go everywhere and send everything before winter sets in. Will glanced everywhere except at him. Adults did that when they hoped he'd go find something else to do, as if he would leave two people talking without him listening in. Ran shook his head. Now he was extra curious because Will didn't want to talk about something in front of him. That usually meant that it involved him. Adults didn't think he knew that, and Ran wouldn't ever tell them that he knew. How's your brother? Will asked Uncle Murren. So that's who Will wanted to talk to. Well, he couldn't do that until Papa woke up. Ran opened his mouth to say that, but Uncle Murren beat him to it. He'll be okay too, but it might take a while. It's hard to tell. Uncle Murren sighed like he was carrying a heavy burden. Ran hoped he wasn't part of that burden, but feared he was. He clasped his uncle's hand and squeezed it. Hopefully that would lighten the load a bit, and maybe it did because his uncle stood a little straighter. Can I talk to him? Will took a step forward into the flat and met an obstacle. Uncle Murren didn't step back. He remained where he stood, blocking access to the foyer and the living room beyond where Papa's room was. You can't talk to him right now because he's recuperating, and he needs to keep doing that in peace. But you can tell me, and I'll tell him when he's awake and well enough to deal with the news you brought. Sure. Is there somewhere we could talk in private? Will gestured to the hallway behind him since he was standing half in the flat and half out of it. Anyone who walked by could overhear this conversation unless they moved it. Yeah, we shouldn't discuss personal business in the hallway. You never know who might be listening. Come in. We can talk in here. Uncle Murren squeezed Ran's hand and led him to the couch. Ran shook his head. Does he expect me to hop onto the couch and wait for them to talk about interesting stuff without me? No way would that happen. Rand didn't bother objecting or complaining, because that would give away his plan. Instead, he followed them to the bedroom he and his uncle were staying in. Uncle Murren shut the door behind him as expected to shut Rand out. But Rand just rolled his eyes and put his ear to the door. Adults were so weird sometimes. Even if they whispered, he should still hear enough to know what they were talking about, because the door didn't sit tightly against the jamb. There was a little space for sound to come through, and he put his ear right against that spot. "Okay, we're alone. What did you come to tell my brother?" Uncle Murren asked, but he didn't even bother to whisper. Rand appreciated that. After all, his uncle did his best to leave him out of the conversation. "But I have sharp ears and I hear everything." Rand grinned because the room was small, so there was nothing Uncle Murren or Will could do to stop him from listening in except maybe whisper. But Will was too agitated for that. "She's back," Will said that like it was a bad thing and that meant trouble for them. Who was this woman? Rand hoped he'd find out as a shiver traveled up his spine. His little family shouldn't have to deal with any more bad people for a while. Who's back? Oh good, Uncle Murren didn't know who Will was talking about either, so maybe Will would explain. "It's her," Will said with more emphasis, like that should help Uncle Murren understand better. "Who are you talking about?" Uncle Murren still didn't get it. "I don't know who it is either." Rand listened harder, because Will kept getting quieter like Papa did when he was angry. But it made him hard to hear through the door. "Come on, Will, tell me because I don't know who you're talking about, and I want to know." But Rand wasn't part of the conversation, so he couldn't demand an explanation either. He could just stand there and let curiosity eat him alive as he clenched his teeth to keep quiet. But it was hard because questions were bubbling around in his head, and Rand had to ask them. Papa said bottling things up was bad, and he might explode if he didn't get an answer soon. But Uncle Murren didn't ask again, and Will didn't say anything either. Damn. They must have figured out he was listening in on the other side of the door. Now they did that annoying thing where they moved their mouths to spell things but no sound came out. That was just mean, because there was nothing to hear through the door until it creaked when it opened, and Rand fell into the room. Uh-oh. Now they knew for sure he was listening. "Rand, sometimes I have to have conversations that you shouldn't overhear." Uncle Murren crouched in front of him to help him up. "I know, but I was curious. Will you tell me who she is?" Rand let his uncle set him on his feet. "Why won't you tell me?" Rand widened his eyes and made his lower lip quiver like he was on the verge of tears, but Uncle Murren didn't fall for it. Drat. "No, I need to tell your father first, and if he thinks you should know, he'll tell you." Uncle Murren picked him up and set him on the bed. "Let me just walk him out, and then I'll read you that story." Uncle Murren shut the bedroom door behind him, ending the conversation. If he and Will said anything else, Rand couldn't hear it from where he sat on the bed. He could have hopped off and followed them to the front door to catch everything they said. But he was already in enough trouble for eavesdropping, so he sat there and waited for his uncle to return. Uncle Murren wasn't gone for more than a few minutes, so they probably didn't talk about anything interesting. Rand felt a little better about being a good boy and staying put. That was probably a good decision, and it might make up for the whole eavesdropping thing. Invisible hands gently gripped his head and turned it until his gaze rested on the box on the shelf and the ornament inside it. "I want to look at it again." Rand bent his knees so he could stand up, then stopped when he remembered his plan. "I'll look at you again when my uncle's sleeping." Rand scooted away from it to the other side of the bed, but the box kept drawing his gaze back to it like it wanted him to pick it up. "No, Uncle Murren will be right back, and I don't want to lose that story he promised me. So I'll be a good boy and sit here." Rand folded his arms, but his fingers itched to touch that crystal ornament again and look at the lights inside it until the door opened. Nothing's the same. Uncle Murren was as good as his word and read 2 stories because they were short. Then Inari knocked on the door and asked if they wanted to join them for dinner, but Rand shook his head and crawled onto his uncle's lap. He wasn't ready for that, not when Papa wouldn't be there for it. Maybe Uncle Murren wasn't ready either, because he wrapped his arms around Rand and asked if they could eat in here. Rand promised not to make a mess, and that convinced her because she returned with a tray of covered dishes for them to share. They ate in silence at the table on the other side of the room, after Uncle Murren moved his books aside. Neither had much to say because everything waited on Papa, and he wasn't well enough to deal with their situation or do anything about it. So all the questions crouched in the corners and waited like rocks about to fall. How long could they stay here? Only Papa could answer that, and he slept most of the time. Rand stared at the floor so he wouldn't look at the box. Uncle Murren seemed to have forgotten about it, and he didn't want to do anything to remind him about it, not now when it was so close to bedtime. Or was it? Rand wasn't sure. Time felt like it paused when Papa collapsed and bled on the stone floor 3 days ago. Nothing was the same anymore. Silence fell outside their room, so it must be late. Come on. Let's get you washed up for bed. Uncle Murren picked up the tray with their dirty dishes. I want to see Papa again. Rand stared at his toes. Uncle Murren sighed. He did that a lot lately, but this was hard for him too. All right. Let me put this tray in the sink. Then we'll see if he's awake. Come on. But you must be quiet in case he's asleep, because we don't want to wake him. He needs to recuperate. Okay. Rand clasped his hand even though they were only crossing the living room to the kitchen, not going across the country to fight monsters. Uncle Murren was as good as his word. He put the dishes in the basin in the sink, added some soap and water and left them to soak. Rand captured his hand after he dried it on a towel. It just felt right to hold tight to his uncle, especially after he'd almost lost him. Rand blinked away tears as they crossed back through the living area to the room where Papa rested. Uncle Murren pushed open the door, and more light fell into the room, sending the shadows running to the corners. Darkness seemed to flow in through the open window, and Uncle Murren headed for it. Rand let go of his hand and approached the bed. Papa, are you awake? Rand reached for his fingers and Papa grasped his hand. Rand gasped. You're awake. Green light shone on him when Papa opened his eyes. Where are we? He asked, and he sounded confused, unlike earlier. Don't worry about that. We're safe, and that's all you need to know. Just please rest and do what they tell you so you get better. Will you do that for us? Uncle Murren gestured to himself and ran to make it clear who he meant by us, as if anybody else would tell Papa that. All of us? Are we all safe? Papa turned his head and gazed at Rand like he was afraid to lose him. What Nolo said the other day echoed in the quiet room, and Rand shivered and dug his toes into the thick carpet until Papa rubbed his back. The familiar feeling of his big hand rubbing slow circles on his back chased the fear away, but it would come back like the shadows crouched in the corners. It wasn't gone, just temporarily pushed off to another time and place to deal with. Yes? We're all safe. Please stop scaring him. We can talk about the rest of this when you're well enough to deal with it. Right now you need to get better. Uncle Murren shut the window with a loud thud and pulled the drapes to cover it. What happened to being quiet? Uncle Murren must have forgotten about that, because he stomped over to the bed and the thick carpet didn't muffle his footsteps much. He scooped Rand up and hugged him tightly as if he caught Papa's worry and shared it. Rand burrowed into him. I don't want to get lost again. I want to stay with Papa and Uncle Murren forever. And he wished Papa was hugging him right now because that would mean that he was okay, and not lying there blinking like he was confused. I'm sorry. I'll get better. Papa closed his eyes instead of getting up and hugging them like he would normally do after an argument. I'll get better, he whispered for emphasis, then said nothing else because he was falling back to sleep. He was better earlier. Rand rested his head on his uncle's shoulder. He was, and that's what counts. You can't go by what we just saw because he wasn't awake, not really. I think he just opened his eyes because his magic told him we were there. So don't worry, okay? Uncle Murren rounded the bed and closed the door on his way out. That's what I thought. But it still worried Rand that Papa forgot their earlier visit. It wasn't like him to do that, even when half asleep. Uncle Murren crossed the living room without even looking at or acknowledging Inari. She sat on the couch and shuffled the deck of tarot cards in her hand. Is everything okay? She asked. Uncle Murren stopped in the doorway to their borrowed room. Everything's just fine. Thank you for letting us stay here until my brother's well. He didn't ask what would happen after that, and Rand bit his lip. Would they stay in Nolo and Inari's comfortable flat, with windows to let the light in and comfy chairs to sit on? Maybe the little lights in that ornament could tell him. If there were crystals that could steal magic, then why not a crystal that could tell him about the future? Even if it was just a pretty crystal with little lights in its belly that made interesting patterns, that was okay too. The world needed pretty things. Another magical box. He'll be okay. Uncle Murren closed the door to their borrowed room and sat on the bed. Apparently he skipped the whole washing up thing and went straight to the go-to bed part. But Rand didn't mind since his plan to get the box hinged on his uncle going to sleep early, and sleeping so deeply that he didn't hear him creeping around. Where's Bear? Rand wasn't sure which bear he was asking about, the ghost bear named Bear who lived in his stuffed bear or his actual stuffed bear. Ghost Bear promised to tell them where he went and what he did since he disappeared multiple times over the last few weeks. But Ghost Bear still didn't explain that yet. I need to question him too. But that could wait until morning. I'll find him. You get comfy. Do you know where you last had him? Or do you know if Ghost Bear took your stuffed bear with him when he went to do whatever he's doing? Uncle Murren smiled like he was suppressing laughter at the silly, sounding question. I don't know. Rand slid off his lap and wished Ghost Bear would leave his stuffed bear at home sometimes since it was his only toy. But he understood why Ghost Bear didn't. That stuffed bear was the only body that spirit had. When he needed a body, he used that stuffed bear. Oh, here it is. Uncle Murren returned from the living room holding a stuffed bear that looked entirely too clean to belong to him. Bear's sparkly bow caught the light as Uncle Murren handed him the toy. Bear, are you in there? Rand tapped the bear's stitched nose. You promised you'd tell us where you went and what you were doing. Bear didn't animate or explain, and no ghost bears appeared either. That was so unfair. Ghost Bear should keep his promises. Rand hugged his stuffed bear even though its ghostly tenant was missing. Ghost Bear would return eventually, and maybe he'd finally tell them what he was doing. Do you want me to read you another story? Uncle Murren sat on the edge of the bed instead of lying down on it, which meant he wasn't going to bed anytime soon. Drat. What was he planning? Uncle Murren wasn't like Papa in a lot of ways, and he was tricky too. But he offered to read him a story, and Rand never passed up a chance to hear one. Yes, I want a story, but not one from a book. Rand tucked Bear under his chin. What kind of story do you want? Uncle Murren swung his legs onto the bed. So he was staying. Rand shifted over to make room for him. I want a story about you and Papa. Oh boy. I don't even know where to start. I feel like he and I have been living an epic tale all our lives. Uncle Murren stared off for a bit, as if he were remembering something. Since he spent a lot of time with Papa, the story might involve Papa too. Rand lay down beside him and fiddled with Bear's ears. Tell me about it. Uncle Murren lay down too and gathered him into his arms like Papa always did, and he felt all warm and fuzzy inside. Rand liked this more demonstrative version of his uncle and hoped he'd stick around. It was nice not being rivals for a change. I think I've got a story you'll like. Uncle Murren even rubbed his back like Papa did too. He's spoiling me. Rand smiled at the thought. Tell me the story. It takes place when I was little like you. Your dad decided the streets of wherever we were living were too dangerous. So one day, with me clinging to his back of course, he climbed a building and jumped. With a little help from his magic, he landed on the next roof over, but I was scared the whole time. I can see Papa do that. He likes high places. So did Rand, but now wasn't the time to remind his uncle about that. One night snow fell and a strange shadow crossed the moon. It looked like a man on a sleigh with 8 reindeer pulling it, and I swear I heard someone yell, "Merry Christmas to everyone and everyone have a good night." Then a box fell and landed right at your dad's feet. Was it like the box from earlier? Rand had to ask, even though he didn't want to remind his uncle about it. No, it was different. So your dad skidded to a halt and sat on the roof like it wasn't pitched at a 45-degree angle. Uncle Murren paused and showed what that looked like. The roof was made of stone slabs and his magic liked stones, so he was fine, but I would have slid off if I wasn't clinging to him for dear life. Thankfully he wrapped a shield around me so I didn't fall. And then he opened the present? Rand couldn't picture a roof or a tall building, since the city under Mount Eredrin didn't have either. But it had a lot of caves, doors, hallways, and statues. I was just getting to that. Yes. He opened the present. Uncle Murren fell silent, and his gaze strayed to the window. It was closed, but through something called glass, stars twinkled in the dark sky. What was inside? Rand poked him when he was silent for too long. More things than should fit inside a box. Uncle Murren said that like it should explain everything. Like what? Rand didn't understand. A box could only hold as much as the space inside it allowed. Everyone knew that, except Uncle Murren. He seemed confused about that. A whole feast. Your dad pulled out a cooked goose that was still warm, fruits, loaves of bread, cheeses, and nuts. Then he stuffed it all back inside and took it out again. Why did he do that? It sounded like strange behavior to Rand, but adults often did things that didn't make sense. That's why he kept a list, so when he grew up he wouldn't do those things. No kid would think him weird, no way. When he was sure the feast wouldn't disappear, he picked me up with help from his magic since I was half his height and weight then. And we set off for the vacant flat we'd found. Uncle Murren stared off again. Who carried the box? Rand poked him to get him talking again because the story wasn't finished yet. His magic did, so it floated after us. Don't look at me like that. I'm serious. The box floated after us on a glowing green cloud of magic. I offered to carry it, but you know how your dad gets when he has a plan. Uncle Murren rolled his eyes for emphasis. Yeah, he doesn't hear anything else. Rand shook his head. Papa had selective hearing when he made up his mind about something. Yup. He carried me back to the vacant flat where we were staying. It still had furniture. Nothing as nice as this place, but it was more than we'd ever had before. Uncle Murrin waved to the table and 2 chairs across from them. The room had a dresser, a closet, a soft carpet, and lots of pillows on the bed too. Did he jump from these roof things to other roof things to get to the flat? Rand could picture Papa jumping from cliff to cliff. No, he did that thing where he just walks off the edge and his magic forms a glowing bridge under him. I close my eyes because that scares the life out of me, but it doesn't faze him at all. Then again, he never looks down. He just expects his magic to catch him, and somehow it always does. Uncle Murrin shook his head. Did you eat the food after all this magicking? Rand could picture the magic bridge. It was so like Papa to create one. Yes, we did, and the box refilled itself by magic every night for 12 days. We ate like kings the whole time. Uncle Murrin stared off and probably relived those memories. They sounded like good times. What happened after the 12 days? Rand poked his uncle's side again. Uncle Murrin laughed, so he must have hit a ticklish spot. Rand filed that away for later when they could tickle each other until they gasped for breath. You know something? I don't remember, but I was so young then. Your dad might remember. He was 11 then. Can we ask him tomorrow? Rand needed confirmation that they would visit Papa again. Sure, if he's awake enough to remember. If not, we'll wait until he's better, okay? Okay. The question served their purpose, and Rand could wait to find out what happened to that other box. His thoughts were already drifting back to the box that arrived today, and the secrets inside the ornament. But Uncle Murrin stared at the ceiling instead of closing his eyes and going to sleep like he was supposed to. Drat. Rand might have a long night of waiting ahead of him, unless his uncle got sleepy soon. There must be something I can do. Rand lay there, warm and comfy in his uncle's arms, and sought a solution to his problem. There must be a way to get his uncle to go to sleep, and he'd stay awake all night if necessary to find it. A bright visitor. Rand woke with a start when a bright light shined on his face. Did Papa come? Rand opened his eyes, but the light wasn't green. It was white, and a gray ball of fur and flailing limbs tumbled out of that vanishing light. Furball, is that you? Rand whispered as the furry creature fell. Thankfully, Furball was only about a foot tall and didn't weigh much for an owlcat. Somewhere under all that fur, his friend had wings, but he didn't use them. Instead, he landed on Rand's chest and knocked the breath out of him. Oof. Yes, it's me. Furball raised his head so he could look him in the eyes. Furball had the same owlish amber eyes as his grandfather Thing, and they were wide like he just had a big shock. That was possible since Furball wasn't all that accurate when he teleported. But that's where the similarities with his formidable grandfather ended. Furball had a small beak and little ears that looked more like a tufted owl's ears than a cat's, but maybe that was the dimness making them appear that way. And that was really it, because Furball had so much fur, it hid his little arms and legs, making him look like his name implied. The sight of him melted away some of Rand's worry about the future. He hugged his little friend. I missed you, Rand whispered. I missed you too. Why are we whispering? Furball extended his stubby arms and returned the hug. Because Uncle Murrin is sleeping, and he needs to stay that way. Rand glanced at his uncle to make sure that was still the case. He wished his uncle would snore or something to show that he was still asleep, but his uncle was a quiet sleeper, so he just lay there. Was he asleep, or did Furball's arrival wake him up? Why do you want him to stay asleep? If he wakes up, he might read us a story, Furball said into his chest, and his hot breath tickled. Rand squirmed to keep from laughing. Let's go into the other room, and I'll explain everything. But we must be quiet so we don't wake anybody up, Rand whispered when he could talk without laughing. He was so glad his friend came to visit. Okay. Let's go. I want to know what's going on, Furball whispered, proving he could be quiet too. Shish. Rand froze when his uncle shifted in his sleep. Was Uncle Murrin waking up? Or worse, was he faking being asleep? How can I tell? Rand listened with every fiber of his being, but the room stayed quiet. Unfortunately, Uncle Murrin didn't talk in his sleep like Papa sometimes did. What's wrong? Furball turned his head to regard Uncle Murrin on the bed next to them. Is my uncle still asleep? I can't tell. Rand hardly dared to breathe lest he wake his uncle, but he hoped that whisper went unnoticed. I think he's asleep. Let's go before we wake him. The longer we stay here, the more likely he'll hear us. Furball stuck a hand out of his fur to point at the door. You're right. And all this whispering was annoying. Rand didn't like being quiet, but he also didn't want his uncle to wake up because that would ruin his plan to get the box. Thankfully, Uncle Murrin was a heavy sleeper, and he didn't move again, not even when Rand slid off the bed with Furball clinging to his chest. The thick carpet absorbed the thud of his feet and his hurried footsteps to the door. Please don't creak. Please don't creak. His prayer must have worked because the door didn't creak. Ran opened the door slowly until he could slip through the gap with his friend. Once on the other side, he pushed the door until it touched the jamb. But he didn't close it all the way because he didn't want it to make that clicking sound when it settled into the jamb. Once he was satisfied, Ran crept around the living room. He closed Nolo and Inari's bedroom door and Neryl's too, in case Furball needed to teleport away in a hurry. But he left Papa's door ajar because a little extra light wouldn't wake him up. He probably wouldn't even notice it since his eyes glowed all the time, so he was used to light shining on his face. The living room still felt too open and exposed, even with 3 of the 4 bedroom doors closed. So he crept through the living room to the foyer, and that short narrow hallway felt more private, even though it led to the living room. The foyer was the furthest from the bedrooms that they could get without leaving the flat. So the foyer would have to do for their little chat. Ran sat on the carpet, and Furball hopped from his arms to the floor. "Okay. We're out of that room. Now will you tell me what's going on?" Furball said in his normal speaking tone. "Shish. We still have to be quiet. I don't know how heavily everyone sleeps." Ran glanced around to see if any of the bedroom doors opened, but none did. "Sorry. I forgot we have to be quiet." Furball patted around the small space on his little furry feet, and his flexible toes dug into the thick nap of the carpet. The foyer was a few feet wider than the door. But there were pegs with coats hanging from them, folded conical things in a tall wicker bucket, boots of all sizes stuck in a multi-layer rack, cubbies with hats, scarves, gloves, different-sized bags all neatly folded, of course. There was also a skinny table with keys, letters, Lumiere crystals, and even some coins on it. The Lumiere crystals sat in a basket, and their light shone through the gaps, giving them plenty of light to see by. "That's okay. It's hard to be quiet." Ran waved that apology away. It was time to change the subject anyway. "How did you find me?" "I just teleported to where you were." Furball shrugged like that was no big deal when it was. The last time his friend had some difficulty with the whole teleportation thing. "But how did you do that?" Because that boggled Ran's mind as he picked at the carpet. He still couldn't decide what color it was. Either the colors changed depending on the lighting, or he imagined that the carpet was lighter now. Maybe it's a magical carpet. Ran patted it to make up for picking at it. If the carpet was magical, then he didn't want it to get mad at him. "Oh, I just made you my destination and poof. There you were." Furball spread his arms like a big magical explosion. "And that worked?" Ran stared at his friend. "I'm here, aren't I?" Furball bowed at his accomplishment. Ran clapped as quietly as he could. "Yes, you are, and I'm glad you came." Even though Ran couldn't understand how his friend had managed that. "So tell me everything. Where did you go when you disappeared? We looked for you, but we couldn't find you anywhere. So I teleported to your uncle. Did he find you?" Furball sat across from him and leaned forward. "Yes, he did. Thanks for sending him to me. My aunt found us too, and then Papa, and now he's healing because he got hurt. Uncle Myron says that's not my fault, but it is." Ran hung his head because this all started because he'd snuck out of Nulthur's flat with Furball to find a baby dragon. "We didn't even find the dragon." Ran hunched his shoulders. He felt small and troublesome again. But they found Savine, and he was also a baby dragon, just not the one they were looking for. "Grandma says your papa will be okay." Furball scooted closer so he could squeeze Ran's knee and offer some comfort. "She watches him when she's not watching me." Now Furball hung his head. "That's why it took a few days for me to visit. I had to wait until my family was all out or sleeping to come and see you." "So you snuck out?" Ran stared at his friend and didn't know what to make of that since sneaking out started all the trouble 3 days ago. Although now it was probably more like 4 days since the 3rd day ended. "Yes?" Furball looked at his toes. "I needed to see you and to apologize. If I'd paid more attention, then I'd have seen where you went and you wouldn't have gotten lost. It wasn't your fault." Ran patted his friend's shoulder, but he was careful because Furball was small with small bones to match, and he didn't want to hurt his friend. Not when he owed Furball a debt of gratitude for waking him up so he could get that box while Uncle Myron was still sleeping. Ran rubbed his face. "I don't remember falling asleep." But he must have because Furball woke him up. Well, it didn't matter now because he was awake, and he would get that box. It preyed on his mind the longer he was awake, and turned every thought back to it like a magic crystal should. And that just made Ran want to find out what it could do all the more. "Are you okay? You got really quiet, and you're never quiet." Furball touched his arm. "I was just thinking about the strange box that showed up today." Ran gave his friend a quick rundown of the events of the day and his plan. "Are you sure you should touch it? It sounds magical. Maybe your uncle's right. Maybe you should let your dad look at it first to make sure it's safe." Furball paced around the foyer and waved his hands as he talked. If it was bad, then the crystal would have hurt me earlier when I held it, but it didn't. Rand glanced at the room where his uncle slept. The box waited on a shelf inside it, and so did the crystal ornament. Furball threw his hands in the air in defeat. You're right. So what's the plan to get the box? Do you want me to teleport onto the shelf and then back again with it? No, you're too bright when you do that, and a second bright light so close to the first one might wake Uncle Murren. But Rand filed that plan away in case he couldn't reach it on his own. Uncle Murren put the box on a high shelf, so he might need help to reach it. We should wait a little longer then, so your uncle falls more deeply asleep. Furball stopped pacing and looked at the couches between them and the room in question. Rand, what are you doing? Papa called from inside his borrowed room. He was awake again. Maybe I can solve 2 mysteries in one night, if Papa remembers the box with the feast inside it that Uncle Murren told me about. Rand rose and raced across the living room with Furball at his heels. He did what? I'm talking to Furball. Rand gestured to his friend as they entered the dim room. Hi, Sarn. Furball waved. Hi, Furball. How's your family? Papa rolled onto his side so he could see them standing in the doorway, and green light from his eyes fell on them. They're okay, but they grounded me for a while. Furball toed the carpet, but he kept his claws retracted so he didn't damage it. Yeah, well, someone needs to ground your grandfather so he stops butting into things that are better left alone. Papa covered his face with his hand. Furball's eyes nearly bugged out of his sockets at that news, and Rand feared his eyes were doing the same thing. What did Thing do now? Rand had to ask. This sounded like the start of an interesting story. Papa let his hand fall onto the bed. Don't listen to me. I'm just annoyed at something he did, but it has nothing to do with you two. That's good, but I still want to know what he did. Will you tell us? Rand stood on tiptoe and steepled his hands in a pose he'd seen people use to beg for coins. If it worked for them, it should work on Papa. I heard Will's voice earlier. Did he come, or did I dream that? Papa said instead of answering his question. Drat. He wasn't in the mood to talk about Thing. Maybe he would be in a few minutes. It could happen. Rand would just ask again later. No, you didn't dream it. He came by to see how you are, and he talked to Uncle Murren for a little while. Rand kept what he'd overheard to himself. It was hard because he wanted to tell Papa all about it, but Uncle Murren was right. Papa should only worry about getting well, not about what his friend and brother talked about. Besides, Rand still didn't know what Will and Uncle Murren talked about, other than a mysterious woman who'd returned. But that wasn't enough of a reason to tell Papa about it. She might just be someone they used to know. Can we go back to what you said a minute ago? Because Rand still needed to know what Thing did. Maybe Papa would tell him now. Sure. What did I say? Papa yawned. You said my grandpa did something annoying. What did he do? Furball hopped from foot to foot. Oh, that. He played mind games. I think he had second thoughts about Nolo finding us. But that's just a guess. Papa blinked sleepily. Drat. He was falling asleep again. What kind of mind games did he play? Rand hoped Papa was still awake enough to answer because this was so interesting. Just what I said. Papa shrugged like he had no better explanation for it. Well, that was frustrating because they needed details. Did he just talk in your head? Furball asked. He didn't want to let this go any more than Rand did. Yeah, and he played with my perceptions. Papa punched the pillow under his head. Maybe he was just fluffing it up, not taking out his frustration with Thing on it. Rand exchanged a shocked glance with Furball. I didn't know he could do that. Me either, but Grandpa has a powerful mind. Furball smoothed the fur on his head so it wasn't sticking up every which way. Teleporting made his fur stand on end. Does your family know you're here? Papa adjusted the pillow under his head. No. I might have teleported myself here without permission. I just wanted to see Rand and make sure he's okay. Furball pointed at Rand then hung his head. You won't tell them, right? He looked at Papa through the fur around his eyes since he didn't have eyelashes. Papa laughed like that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I don't tell him anything. But he reads everything from my mind and I can't stop him. My magic doesn't work like that. Papa pounded his fist on the bed. That was true. Will you get in trouble for coming here without permission? Rand turned to his friend. He hoped Furball wouldn't be in too much trouble so they could hang out again. I don't think so. Grandpa went out before I left. If I get home before he comes back, then he'll never know. Furball shrugged like that wasn't an impossible task. Maybe he had a way to know when his grandfather headed home. Rand didn't know how his friend could pull that off. Furball was resourceful, but Thing just knew things. A tap on the windows startled them all. There were no trees near enough to tap on the glass, so it wasn't a branch. An owlish silhouette stood on the deep windowsill. Uh-oh. Rand remembered his uncle closing the drapes earlier, so someone must have opened them between then and now. What was that? Furball asked because he was too short to see over the bed. Otherwise he'd know who stood on the windowsill outside the room. Papa groaned like he was in pain. Your grandfather is outside. Furball opened and closed his beak, but no words came out as his eyes grew real wide. Since his friend couldn't ask, Rand did. Why's he out there? He wants to talk to me. Papa pulled the pillow out from under his head and covered his face with it. But that wouldn't get him out of a conversation with a mind reader. Rand decided not to mention that. Papa was already upset about his late-night visitor. Maybe Thing came for a magic lesson. But he should wait until Papa was better for that. Rand didn't suggest that because Papa didn't enjoy the other lessons before he got hurt, but he needed them. Does he know I'm here? Furball whispered as if that would stop a mind reader from hearing his question. Probably. Papa removed the pillow from his face and shoved it under his head again. Am I in trouble? Furball backed out of the room. I don't know. You'll have to ask him. Sarn waved to the silhouette of an owl tapping on the glass with a furry hand that was a miniature version of Rand's hand. Oh? Furball backed into the living room. Maybe you should talk to him, and we'll go play quietly like good children. Furball steepled his little hands like he was praying. That sounded like a good idea to Rand since he might need his friend's help to get the box. That was still the plan, despite this interruption. But first he needed to make sure Uncle Murrin was still asleep. I'll shut this so you can talk in private. Rand backed out and swung the door closed before Papa could do anything except groan again, because he didn't want to talk to Thing either. But that was his problem, and Rand left him to it. Now what? Furball whispered when there was a solid door between them and his grandfather. I don't think Uncle Murrin locked the window. Rand doubted the glass would keep that owlcat out for long since Thing had opposable thumbs. He'd find some way to open the window and let himself in. Thing was tricky like that, but he was Papa's problem. Rand turned toward Uncle Murrin's room. Come on? We'd better get the box before anything else happens. Before Rand could move, the door to the room next to Papa's opened, and Nerul yawned as he stuck his head out. Uh-oh. Their plan just hit another snag. A strange twist. Thing knocked on the glass again. He sat on the windowsill outside the flat like an evil spirit waiting to pounce on the unwary. A breeze stirred his dark feathers and his amber eyes seemed to glow. Thing draped his folded wings over his shoulders like a cloak and knocked again, shaking the glass in its casement. Open the window and let me in. Sarn wished his magic didn't open the drapes to let the starlight in. But it did that because he wanted to see the one thing that hadn't changed in the last few days, the night sky. If it hadn't opened them, then he wouldn't know Thing was there or have to deal with him. Let me in. We need to talk, Thing said again in his head as he tapped on the glass with his claws. Don't scratch the glass. I can't afford to replace it. And Sarn doubted Thing could either. Just thinking about getting up made the room spin around Sarn, so he lay there instead, feeling weak and tired again. I can't. I'm too dizzy. I'll fall and crack my head open if I try. And that was reason enough to stay put. Besides, Rand might hear him fall, and his son would come running if he did. I don't want to worry him any more than I already did. I wish he wasn't worried about me at all. But that wasn't something he could fix. He could just get better like he promised, and sort out the mess he'd created by keeping his son a secret for so long. I won't let you fall. Earth magic seeped out of his hands and coalesced into a man-shaped cloud perched on the edge of the bed. I'm watching your son too. He's fine, his earth magic said in answer to his unspoken question. It was fond of Rand. I won't let him leave the flat. Murrin is fine too. Thank you, Sarn thought because he was too choked up to speak for a moment. Let me in. You're overdue for another lesson since you're talking to an inanimate force. I shouldn't have to keep reminding you, but I will since I can't get one important fact through your thick skull. Your magic isn't talking to you. You're talking to yourself. Thing rattled the glass. Go away. I don't want to talk to you. Especially not about his magic since Thing didn't even have the same kind. Let me recuperate in peace. Sarn covered his face with his hands to remove Thing from his sight. No. We need to talk. I was a bit heavy-handed the other day, and I might owe you an apology. Thing actually sounded sheepish and maybe a little sorry. Was that ornery owl actually apologizing? Sarn uncovered his face and risked a glance at the window. He still didn't want to talk to Thing, But that creature owed him an apology for playing with his perceptions the other day. You told Nolo where I was. I let him write to you. I wouldn't have had to do that if you had just told him about your son years ago. You created this mess. Don't blame me for it. I just helped expose it. Thing glared at him, and his amber eyes seemed to look right through Sarn, but that was Thing's mind gift at work. He hated that the owlcat could read every thought in his head. Stop being rude and open the window so we can talk outside of your mind since you hate this so much. I refuse to yell at you through the glass. Thing drummed his claws on the stone windowsill. No. I'd rather the glass stayed between us. Even though that wasn't a barrier for communication, because that mind-reading owl could just talk in his head. But he could do nothing about that, except lie there and get annoyed. Sarn levered himself up enough to sip from the glass someone, maybe it was Murren, left on the bedside table. Then don't get up. Get your magic to open the window. Thing tapped on the glass again. Sarn laughed at the suggestion. My magic doesn't like anything except rocks. The window wasn't made of rocks, but they surrounded it. Are you sure you want to keep him out? It might be better to let him in so he can say his piece and leave, said his magic. That man-shaped cloud of green light and magic walked across the room to the window and slid it open. It had a point, and Sarn knew it, so he didn't retract it or tell it to stop. As soon as the window swung outward on metal hinges, and Thing leapt off the sill before it could push him off. He glared at the cloud of magic as he flew through the gap. His magic glared back as it closed the window, then leaned against the wall with its arms folded like a bored sentry. Sarn didn't know what to make of that. His magic had become more vocal over the last 6 months, and now it was taking a human form now and mimicking his body language. That's not normal. Thing landed on the end of the bed and gestured to the glowing green man by the window. Nothing about me has ever been normal, so why should anything about my magic be? Sarn sipped the glass of water to avoid saying anything else. That's a problem you'll have to solve on your own. Thing tilted his head as he studied the man-shaped cloud of magic. Why did you come? Sarn set the glass on the table and lay down again. To see how you are. You need to eat something too, not just drink fluids. There's some soup under the first lid. It's mostly broth, but you need that too. Thing flew to the bedside table and alighted next to the covered dish in question. He lifted the cover and ladled some broth into a tall mug. Here. Drink it. This isn't why you came. Sarn levered himself up again and took the mug. No, but my mate will ask if you ate anything. If you drink that, then I can say you did. I thought you came to apologize. Sarn sipped from the mug. The salted broth was warm and comforting. Someone, probably Inari, had taken the time to make it for him, and he felt like a heel all over again for what he'd done. I did, but not you, said his white magic. I was trying to help, and it was your wish then that all who saw your son swear to never tell anyone else about him. It was, and that no longer mattered since Nolo knew about Ran. But I woke up enough to realize what you were doing, and I didn't stop you. Sarn stared into the mug of amber liquid. It tasted like carrots and celery in summertime. You should make amends for that, Thing said, because he'd read the whole thing from his mind, the eavesdropping annoyance. I will. I haven't seen her since last Friday. After that last visit to show her, Ran was quite fine in his keeping. Everything had gone wrong and ended with Nolo discovering his son. And I got 2 stab wounds. Sarn hadn't seen Inari since that visit to this very flat last Friday. She'd obviously come and gone many times, as the table laden with soup, sweet tea, and water attested. I don't deserve any of it. Sarn set the mug on the table. Then get better and earn it. Thing refilled the mug and handed it back to him. A slice of bread sank to the bottom as it soaked up the liquid. Sarn didn't even see that trickster put the bread in there. Wait until it disintegrates. We don't know how much that demon could heal your internal injuries, but you're not vomiting, and the remaining wounds aren't that deep anymore. So everyone hopes that just your muscles and skin need to knit. That's a lot less risky than the original wounds you had. Thing folded his arms over the line where his feathers melted into gray fur. What do you know about that? Sarn hoped Thing knew more than Murren had. It sounded preposterous, but if anyone could pull off something like that, it would be his formidable twin sister. I only know what I read from your sister's mind, and she didn't understand everything Stramos said either. Thing ruffled his feathers and shifted from foot to foot like he wanted to pace, but there wasn't any room to do that on the bedside table. Couldn't you read the demon's mind? Sarn sipped the broth. Yes and no. His thoughts were like whispers slipping through my mental fingers, but your sister's thoughts were as loud as a bullhorn. I couldn't mute her, so I could try to hear him better. Not that it matters since she took that demon with her when she left. Thing shrugged like he hadn't just admitted he wasn't all-powerful. Sarn almost choked on the bread at the bottom of the glass, but all the broth had awakened a powerful hunger within him. He swallowed the bread as Thing reached for the mug. Here. Have some more. You need it. Thing handed back the mug with more broth and another piece of bread floating in it. And no, I'm not all-powerful. I never said I was. I thought you came to apologize, but you haven't done that yet. Sarn took the mug and fished the bread out. He wanted that more than the broth. Drink the broth too. Until we're sure your stomach is healed, you must be careful. Thing shook a finger at him as Sarn polished off the dripping bread. He could eat a whole loaf. He was so hungry. It's healed, his earth magic said, and that statement startled Sarn so much he almost dropped the mug and spilled the broth. What are you saying? You can't heal me. We don't have that kind of power. Sarn set the mug down with shaking hands. No, we don't. You humans are too watery inside, and we hate water. The glowing green man-shaped cloud of magic shuddered. Sarn sensed a butt was coming. What could his magic have done? Then how do you know my stomach is healed? Sarn glared at Thing when he heard the owl draw breath to speak. He couldn't let that owl interrupt his magic or it might not answer. It was never hurt. The knife was not made of water. It was metal, and metal comes from a stone. His magic shrugged like it wasn't doling out its explanation in maddeningly small chunks. What did you do? Sarn wished his magic hadn't learned its terseness from him. We don't like water, but we don't like sharp metal things piercing you either, so we wrapped around the tip and pushed your stomach aside. But the other ropey organ things were in the way, and the knife scratched them. His magic left the window and floated across the room to sit on the edge of his bed. Did we do the right thing? Glowing green hands wrapped around his and Sarn nodded. He was too shocked to speak, but so was Thing. He didn't argue that Sarn was talking to himself, and he was glad because right then he couldn't have handled that. The demon healed the wound to the ropey things in here. His earth magic rested a glowing green hand against his stomach. What about the wound back here? Sarn gestured to the wound to his lower back. It ached from sitting up for so long. We turned it away from anything important, said his earth magic. Green glowing arms wrapped around Sarn as he absorbed what his magic said. His magic seeped back into him, and the room was darker without it. Sarn lay down again and stared at the ceiling, so he didn't have to look at Thing. I'm not talking to myself. I don't know what just happened. Thing hopped off the bedside table onto the bed, and he paced its length. My magic talked to us. That's what happened. I don't know why you can't accept that. You heard what it said. Sarn covered his face with his hands. He was done with this conversation, but Thing wasn't. He peered at that pacing bird through the gaps between his fingers. I heard it, and that's what troubles me. Thing flew to the window and pushed on the glass to swing it open. Where are you going? Sarn let his hand fall onto the bed beside him. I need some time to think about this. Magic isn't alive or sentient, not like we are. Maybe yours isn't. But the Earth is a living entity. Just look at the enchanted forest or Mount Eredrin itself. They are both aware of us. But my magic won't harm anyone. It just wants to protect me and everyone else I know. Sarn stopped talking and didn't say anything else because he didn't want to delay Thing's departure. He needed that owlcat to leave so he could think about all this in peace. I hope for your sake that never changes. I'll be back to check on you. For now, sleep. Think about this tomorrow. Thing waved a furry hand and sleep pounced on Sarn, dragging him under before he could protest. That was Thing's doing, that meddlesome owlcat. Who are you? Rand just stood there and stared at Nerul, and that probably made him look guilty of something. But he didn't do anything yet except creep around the dark apartment. Maybe guests weren't supposed to do that. Rand would ask about that when his mouth started working again. Too many questions crowded his mind, but none fell out of his mouth. Would Nerul tell on them? Who would he tell? What are you doing up at this hour? Nerul yawned and rubbed his eyes. We were just talking. Furball hopped from foot to foot, because he was nervous or impatient to get the box and see the crystal ornament. Who are you? Nerul blinked, then stepped backward in surprise because he'd never met an owlcat before. Oops. Were people supposed to know owlcats lived under the mountain? I should have asked that, but I didn't think anyone would be awake at this hour. And now Rand would be in trouble if no one was supposed to see his friend. I can't do anything right anymore. Rand stared at his toes. Please don't take this the wrong way because I'm not asking to be rude, but Nerul paused as he crouched down to get a better look at Furball. What are you? I mean, aside from the cutest creature I've ever seen before, because you definitely are that. No offense taken. It's an understandable question, but I'm happy to be the first owlcat you meet. I'm less of an owl and furrier than some of my family. I'm Furball, by the way. Furball stuck his hand out for a shake. Nerul crouched and took his little hand gently with just his fingertips. I'm Nerul, and I'm very glad to meet you. I've never met a magical creature before. And I've never met a human boy before, so we're even. Furball shook his fingers. That comment startled Ran out of his funk, and he found a lot of words really fast. Hey. What about me? I'm a human boy too. You're the son of a mage, so I don't think you count. Furball poked his thigh because he couldn't reach his belly. Why not? I'm human. At least Ran thought he was, but he'd never asked Papa about that. The question had just never come up before, and he just assumed he was human since he looked it. But you're magical, and I'm not. Nerul nodded like this all made sense to him. Ran didn't understand why they were ganging up on him. But this presented a problem. How could he get the box now? Nerul didn't look likely to go back to bed anytime soon. I'm being rude. You should both come into my room so we can talk without disturbing anyone. Nerul opened his door all the way. Curiosity propelled Ran inside. Was his room like the room he shared with Uncle Murren? Did Nerul have a stuffed bear? Ran needed to know. Starlight shined through the glass window, and it was just enough to see the shapes of the same furniture as in Uncle Murren's borrowed room. They were just arranged differently. But there were also shelves along one wall with small human-shaped shadows on it. What are those? Ran pointed at the figures. They're my collection of rangers. A ranger makes them and gives them to the kids every Christmas. Nerul reached for one as another door opened. Ran, where are you? I heard your voice a moment ago, but I don't see you, Uncle Murren said around a yawn. Uh-oh. Now his uncle was awake too. Now I'll never get the crystal. Ran trudged past Furball into the living room to face his yawning uncle. I'm right here. I didn't leave the flat. Nerul invited us into his room to talk so we wouldn't wake anyone. Who is us? Uncle Murren stretched his arms over his head. That would be me. Hi Murren. It's nice to see you again. Furball padded out of Nerul's room and waved. Hi Furball. Does your family know you're here? Uncle Murren rubbed his eyes. Probably. My grandfather visited your brother while we were talking to him, and you know how he is. Furball shrugged. Is he still here? Uncle Murren headed for Papa's door as a green light shined under it. I don't know. Grandpa doesn't tell me anything. But he's probably still here since he didn't tell me to go home. Furball stayed put though. Maybe he wanted to put off seeing his grandfather again. Uncle Murren flung open the door to Papa's room as Ran rushed to join him. But he reached the door as Uncle Murren closed it. Ran skidded to a stop so he didn't collide with the bedroom door or his uncle. Is he still here? Keep your voice down. Your father's sleeping and we don't want to wake him. Uncle Murren shooed him away from the door. What about Thing? Is he still here? Ran tried to see around his uncle even though the door was closed. He didn't hear that owlcat, but Thing was tricky, and he was only quiet when he was mind-talking. So the silence coming from Papa's borrowed room didn't mean anything. I didn't see him, so he must have left. Uncle Murren caught his arm and towed him away from the bedroom door. I should go too. Furball looked at the floor, and he picked at the thick carpet with his flexible toes. You shouldn't go alone. Uncle Murren glanced at the door that led to the rest of the underground city, then headed for it, but he didn't open that door. Instead, he stopped at the table nearby and picked up a set of keys. But he just stared at them like he wasn't sure if he should borrow them because they were guests. Ran understood his dilemma, so he padded over to reassure his uncle. I won't let them lock you out. Ran wrapped his arms around his uncle's legs. He didn't want him to go, but Furball was small, and he was probably in enough trouble for teleporting here without permission. If he teleported back, that would just compound the trouble he was already in. Thank you. Uncle Murren ruffled his hair. We'll both sit right here and wait for you to come back. If you have any trouble, just knock and we'll let you in. Nerul gestured to the couch. Ran nodded and let go because that was a great idea, and it would get his uncle away from the flat. Thank you both. Uncle Murren glanced at the keys, then put them back on the table. Come on, Furball. Let's go to your home. Uncle Murren walked over to Furball and crouched down in front of him. Thank you. I'll be in less trouble if you take me home. Furball hopped into his arms. I know. Next time get permission first. You're always welcome to come visit us. Uncle Murren set Furball on his shoulder, and the little owlcat grabbed onto his cloak with his long finger-like toes. Thanks for coming, Furball. I missed you a lot. Ran waved to his friend. I'll come again soon when I'm not grounded anymore. Furball waved back as Uncle Murren headed for the door. I'll knock so you know it's me, but I'll leave the door unlocked, okay? Uncle Murren stood in the doorway with Furball and glanced at them. Sure. We'll be right here. Nerul sat on the couch and Ran padded over to join him. Thank you again. Uncle Murren stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind him. You're welcome. Ran stood by the couch. How could he get away from Nerul for long enough to get the crystal ornament? Take him home. Murren stared at the door for a moment, then shook himself out of his reverie. Ran would be okay for a little while. The sooner he got on his way, the sooner he'd return. After all, Nerul was a nice kid, and he should keep Ran out of trouble. What am I thinking? Ran is a good kid too. What happened a few days ago wasn't his fault. Are you okay? Furball patted his cheek. Yeah. I was just borrowing trouble, even though I know better. Murren turned and faced the hallway crowded with statues in fighting stances. It was just hard juggling everything. With Sarn in and out of consciousness, Murren had to watch his nephew every hour of the day and night too, since the lovable child wouldn't stay asleep until morning. I hope you heal fast, bro. We can't stay in limbo like this. Something must give, and Murren hoped it wouldn't be his family. But he already dodged a lot of questions about Ran's mother and several other things in the last 3 days, because they were questions Sarn should answer. I don't know how long I can dodge these questions, bro. You need to get better and sort things out with Nolo. Nerul's father was hurt and angry, but Murren couldn't do anything about that. I didn't hide Ren from him for years. Sarn did that. Are you sure you're okay? Furball patted his cheek again to get his attention. Yeah. I'm just worried about our situation. Do you know why your grandfather stopped by to see my brother? Murren didn't ask before because he didn't want to upset Ran, not when the kid was back to his sunny self finally. No, he didn't tell me why he came. In fact, he didn't even say hi to us, and Ran and I stood on the other side of the bed. He must have known we were there. Furball threw his little hands in the air, then grabbed a handful of his hood when Murren turned a bend. The hallways were empty of living people, but there were plenty of statues scattered about. They glared at them with glowing crystal eyes, but that was normal. I know you told Ran you would take me home, but could you take me to Nulthar instead? Furball steepled his hands and widened his eyes like Ran liked to do when he wanted something. He couldn't quiver his lower lip because he had a beak instead, but Furball tried. The little owlcat was so damn cute. How could he say no? You'll be in less trouble if Nulthar brings you home, right? Murren had watched that scenario play out many times in the weeks his family lived with the owlcats. Yes? Furball nodded emphatically, but didn't let up on the beseeching looks he gave him. Still? Your grandparents must have noticed you use Nulthar like a shield. Murren stopped in the middle of the hallway. Where was Nulthar at this hour? They know, but they're more lenient when he's around. So will you take me to him? Furball collapsed his hands together like he was praying. Do you know where he is? Murren hoped this wouldn't take him away from Nolo and Inari's flat for too long. Ran was a good kid, but he could still get into trouble by accident, especially now since their situation was so precarious. One wrong move could change things. I don't know where we could go either. I can't manage Ran and my brother. Sarn doesn't listen to me when he's well. There's no chance he'll listen to me when he's hurt. That just wouldn't happen. Sarn would try to take charge and probably injure himself further. No, his brother needed to stay where he was. Murren glanced behind him, but he couldn't see Inari and Nolo's door from here. I always know where he is. Furball pointed to another hallway branching off this one near a fountain ahead. I'll take you to him, if you tell me everything about your grandfather's visit. Murren caught Furball's gaze, and the owlcat nodded. You've got a deal. Furball relaxed a bit, and didn't clutch his cloak so tightly as he began his tale. 10 minutes later, Murren almost tripped as he considered everything Furball told him. My brother said that. What the heck did Thing do? What were these mind games? Murren could guess, but he'd rather have answers. I don't know. Your brother didn't say even though we asked. Furball shrugged. Well, that clinched it. Sarn wouldn't want to go back to Nulthar's place, not after Thing played some kind of mind games with him. Murren would have to wait until morning to ask his brother about it. Did your grandparents say anything about it? Murren hoped they dropped a hint or made a comment. Not in my hearing. Furball straightened. Stop. Why? Murren peered down the hallway at the man striding toward them. Oh, is that him? There were too many plants in the way, including a few potted trees, and the foliage obscured part of the hallway. The statues added more obstacles because the Lithurians liked clutter. Yes? Furball waved. We're over here. I see you, but what are you doing out here in the middle of the night? Nulthar rounded the last plant and strode toward them. His blue tunic and trousers were creased like he'd spent a long time at his desk, and there were dark circles under his green eyes. Even his pendant's light was dim, like its energy was also at a low ebb. I went to see Ran. Furball launched into an explanation of the night's doings as soon as Nulthar was close enough for him to hop into the guard captain's arms. The minute his story ended, Furball melted into a purring puddle of fur and half-closed eyes as Nulthar rubbed the little owlcat's head, ears, and back. He liked to spoil him, and that was the real reason Furball wanted to see him. Despite all his efforts, Murren had never gotten an accurate count of how many owlcats shared Nulthar's flat with him. And he'd even recruited Ran to help with that project. "You spoil him." Murren laughed at the silly expression on Furball's face. "True, but he's so easy to spoil." Nulthar smiled at the limp owlcat in his arms. "How's your brother?" "He's recuperating." Murren stifled a yawn. He didn't know what woke him earlier and sent him looking for Ran. Perhaps some part of him sensed the tyke left the room. Murren hoped so, because that would mean he had a little magic of his own. "How's your nephew?" Nulthar studied him while he petted Furball. "Ran's okay, but he blames himself for what happened, even though it would have happened eventually anyway. There was nothing he could have done to avoid it." Murren wished Ran would believe that. "I'll keep reminding him. He's young. He'll bounce back. It'll just take a little while." "How are things with Nolo?" "I don't see him much since he works nights and sleeps all day. I think he's avoiding us and the situation until Sarn's well enough to deal with it." It made things awkward in the interim, but Murren was glad for the space. "That's not the only reason he's working so much, but he should have some help soon since Gerlo's vacation is almost over." "I forgot about that." Sarn mentioned it, but Murren couldn't picture the commander of the Rangers taking a vacation. What would the man do without any Rangers to order around? Murren couldn't picture the gruff man sitting around reading or doing anything regular folk did to relax. Nolo should take a vacation when Gerlo returns. He needs one, and not just so he'll have time to sort out everything with your family. Nulthar shut his mouth too quickly, like he was stopping himself from saying something. It was a habit Sarn had, and it drove Murren nuts. But he dialed back the annoyance because Nulthar was still a stranger, since he worked most of the time too. What the hell was he holding back? It was something about Nolo, since that's what they were talking about. What did he know? "Well, it's late. I need to take this little guy home so he can explain to his grandparents why he thought sneaking out was a brilliant idea." Nulthar smiled at Furball as the little owlcat burrowed into his chest. "I know you were worried about your friend. Next time ask first." "I will," Furball said into his chest. "Will he be in a lot of trouble?" Murren waved to Furball. "No, I'll tell them we have an understanding, and he'll promise not to do that anymore." Nulthar rubbed Furball's back. The little owlcat winked at Murren over his shoulder, then buried his head in Nulthar's uniform. Murren faked a cough to stifle laughter. That little stinker. He had Nulthar wrapped around his little fingers. "I should head back since it's late." Murren gestured to the way he came to hide his face and the laughter bubbling under the surface. "Tell your brother we wish him well. Not just me, but my friends too." Nulthar meant the owlcat staying with him. "Does that include Thing?" Murren couldn't help but ask because that owl was so contrary, there was no knowing how he felt about anything. "Of course he does. Thing can be difficult to understand sometimes, but he has a big heart, and your family has a place in it. Never forget that." Nulthar turned and walked away without another word. But talk of Thing must have drawn his attention because his voice boomed in Murren's mind a moment later.